Thank you. And I'd like to thank also all the doctoral students and postdocs, and I guess you're called faculty here. I don't know what you're called, fellows, for many interesting conversations over the last 10 weeks. Like the third Matrix movie, this one is a little too much action, not enough thought, and the plot line disappears at points. So what I'm going to do, again, so you know where we're going, first a quick rerun of previous episodes, then a few words, actually more than a few words, that's part of the problem, about the contradictions involved in the dollar as global quasi-state money. And then very briefly, a bit on challengers to the dollar over the past 50 years and why they failed. And then responses to the current inflection point in the global economy, and which is also about responses to these contradictions around the dollar. So just to remind you, those of you who didn't come to the first two lectures, what I said in lecture one was that we needed to have a system level approach because deflation was a constant in capitalism. And so we need to know where credit growth comes from. Second, that this credit growth is embedded in a hierarchical system, in an empire in which the US state, understood in an expansive sense, is central, and that it had very heterogeneous relations with subordinate units. And third, that money is credit, and credit has varying degrees of acceptability to different actors, and that within nation states, typically the money that the state validates is the most acceptable form, and that we can model the role of the dollar in the global economy on that chartalist perspective, because dollar-denominated credit issued from the Federal Reserve is the backing for almost all monetary systems in the world economy. I also, in the second lecture, talked about mechanisms that lock people into the dollar as the world's currency, stressing late development as a system-level mechanism. Late development involved, for the countries that were successful in doing late development, involved a repression of domestic demand, which made profitability and economies of scale depend on exporting, and even better on net exports. Net exports, of course, require someone to be a net importer. That net importer must issue assets or some kind of debt to cover those net imports, and that's the connection to the dollar. Similarly, the accumulation of these assets in the hands of business actors and the accumulation of dollar-denominated credit on the balance sheets of banks engaging in cross-border lending also lock those actors into use of the dollar. And the problem here, of course, is that these processes generate a number of dilemmas or antinomies. Antinomies is soft contradiction, and these generate endogenous decay of the ability of the US state to maintain the dollar as global quasi-state money, which is what I'm going to talk about today. And you'll remember I started the first lecture with this very complicated chart, which I'm going to go right past because it's too complicated. We're going to break down the elements here. But the point is to say that there's a multiple set of dilemmas. It's not just Triffin's old dilemma about liquidity versus confidence. And remember that for Triffin, liquidity versus confidence meant, is there enough trade credit? Is there confidence that dollars can be redeemed for gold? These words mean something different today. But the first pair of antinomies I want to talk about is the tension between adequate credit growth to offset deflation and the risk of financial crisis, and then how that connects to central bank, meaning mostly the Fed, attempting to bail out the financial system when a crisis happens, and how that connects to the social basis of support for the dollar as the global central currency. So the first two kinds of dilemmas, or the first trilemma, is this tension here. And the basic problem is that it's growth that provides output legitimacy for most systems. In particular, in the US, growth provides a social base for the dollar. This is homologous to what happened in the British Empire in the late 19th century, where labor supported free trade because free trade meant cheap food, and cheap food meant a rising real wage. So similarly in the US, growth, and I'll talk more about growth in the US later on, growth is the social base for political support for the dollar, or has been until now. This growth relies on excess credit creation. And those of you who know banks or who have been in the business world know, as I maybe said earlier, no one gets promoted for being below average. No one gets bonuses for being below average. So at a sociological level, there's always a tendency for the banking system to overcreate credit. And as Minsky tells us, it's not just sociological. Each new emission of credit validates prior extensions of credit and therefore rewards risk-taking behavior. So the system is selecting for actors who engage in more and more risky behavior, and this ultimately gives you a situation in which actors are relying on continued appreciation of assets to validate their borrowing so they can pay back their debts. And so you get a crisis. And that's magnified in two ways at the global level. One is that the inadequate degree of regulation means shadow banking is, as we would say in the US, a wild west, and that there's also degree of currency mismatch in this lending. So it's not just the usual Minsky dynamic, but it's Minsky with even less regulation than he would expect, and Minsky plus currency mismatch. So what you have is a constant tendency towards crisis, and this forces the Fed to step in and bail out the financial system. And it's done so in ever more formal ways. Those of you who are a bit older, remember in the 19th century, those of you who are a bit older, remember the 1982 Latin American debt crisis, in which the Fed helped the Treasury and the IMF delay marking to market the debts of Latin American debtors, because had those debts been marked to market, the 9 of the 10 largest banks in the US would have been bankrupt. And so that was the first round of intervention. And if we just fast forward to 2008 and 2010, you now have a much more formal system of swaps and overnight repo lending by the Fed. So more and more bailouts. Sounds great. Okay, we make too much credit, we get a bailout. The problem is that these bailouts reward bad financial actors for bad financial decisions and therefore worsen income inequality, which conflicts with the social base of support for the dollar, because while there may be aggregate growth, the distribution of that growth is very uneven, with the average person getting less and less growth or maybe no growth. For those of you who are not Americans, the average male high school graduate in the US has had negative 25% growth, meaning lost 25% of real income over the last 40 years. That makes people unhappy. And this is why you get claims, rhetoric of auditing the Fed and things like that. And so where we are now, after 40 years of this process, is a world in which roughly half of the financial assets in the world are organized under shadow banking writ large, which includes Benjamin Braun, who's not here, Benjamin Brown's favorite actors, my favorite actors as I approach retirement age, the Saudis, etc., and the crooked banks, and then a number of other smaller actors. And of course, these are the ones who are in fact very bad actors and usually get a lot of the blame, but they're not the most important here. So we have a system in which the tendency towards crisis has gotten even larger because of all this money floating around in these essentially unregulated spheres. And that's what drives this loss of legitimacy, which here I give you as a loss of trust in the two big central banks. So this is public opinion polls. I don't really like public opinion polls, but they tell us something. So here you can see from the onset of the 2010 Eurozone crisis, a loss of trust in the ECB. This is net trust. So below the black line is more people distrust the ECB than trust it. And the same thing for the Fed, more or less, with a blip up for COVID. And this will become important later for those of you who don't know what the Fed did during COVID in the US domestic market. They basically guaranteed the par value of every financial instrument in the economy. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, mortgage-backed securities and debt, municipal debt, money market funds, corporate bonds, everything. Okay, so I think that explains a little bit of the relief. No one had to worry, but overall you can see this decline. And that gives you this growing right-wing populism, but also left-wing populism, since many of the people on either extreme are very labile and move back and forth across those old left-right distinctions. So that's the first set of contradictions. There's another contradiction between global financial stability and the inflation goals of the Fed, and it also interacts with legitimacy. And here the problem is that in order to get high US growth, the Fed typically is lowering interest rates, which mostly operate in the US economy through the housing market, a little bit less so through the automobile market. And as the economy picks up steam, of course, the economy moves to a higher rate of inflation potentially. And the Fed's response to that is usually to increase interest rates. And when the Fed increases interest rates, that has international repercussions. And the international repercussions are that the dollar exchange rate goes up against other currencies. Now, you might expect, the naive expectation here is a stronger dollar might be good for the world economy because it enables the US to import more goods. And from the Fed's point of view, that might be good in helping inflation, cheaper imports, lower prices overall at the margin. But it turns out that this is not how things really work in the world. A higher US interest rate, because we're now in a world of complex global value chains, which all have to be financed, and here's global quasi-state money entering the chat, all have to be financed with mostly dollar-denominated loans. Higher interest rates and a more expensive dollar have negative effects on growth in the periphery writ large, and also raise the cost of, because they raise the cost of financing all that trade, and they also raise the cost of imported intermediate goods that are incorporated into domestic production in the periphery. So higher Fed interest rates tend to produce, as their first order consequence, a tendency towards slower peripheral growth and debt crisis, because the lack of growth makes it hard in the US economy, and the lack of growth domestically makes it harder to service those offshore, mostly dollar-denominated debts. And this goes back to the central bank crisis problem, which is, peripheral debtors can't pay back their loans or service their loans. What do we have to do? Right, we have to bail out the financial system and enable peripheral countries to export again. So you do end up, as a second-order consequence, getting bailouts that lead to an erosion of the U.S. social base, because the U.S. has to act as buyer of last resort in the world economy. Third, or fourth and fifth, but the third little triangle, the U.S. is sitting at the top of a global empire. It wants to stay there. I don't know how many of you, you have to be in the weeds to be following this kind of stuff, but I don't know how many of you have listened to recent speeches by the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan in the US. Anybody? No. He's. If you want, email me later, and I will email you back the critical speech. But basically, what the guy has been saying is the Chinese are a problem, and we need to make sure that they don't become a big problem, and therefore we're going to do the following things. And I'll talk about this also later. A lot of industrial policy, a lot of sanctions on China. And we have to make sure that the US economy grows faster than the Chinese economy. So in Washington's world, this question of dominance and differential growth matters. And current account deficits there are a two-edged sword. On the one side, they provide extra resources to the economy. But on the other side, of course, they are a drag on growth, and they enable peripheral economies, and here critically it's China that matters, to catch up. Secondarily, those current account deficits call into question the confidence, but not in Triffin's sense, in the assets the US economy puts out into the world to pay for its current account deficit. So you have another set of contradictions between getting global growth, which the US wants, the US current account deficit, which has to be managed at a sustainable level, and US dominance. And this connects back to the legitimacy question, because the US social base did benefit for about 20 years from cheaper imports, largely from China. The rate of inflation for consumer non-durables over the last 40 years has essentially been zero. Okay? In real life, what that meant was, for the 20 years where this worked, when I raised my kids, I could go out and buy a piece of clothing for a child for €3. Okay? As compared with my parents, who, if we account for inflation, were probably paying about $10, so let's say €9 for the same piece of clothing. And that worked because the broad mass of American consumers benefited from disinflation in consumer non-durables. And the people who were hurt were largely non-voting parts of the population, in particular Black women, who were the core labor force in the clothing industry. So nobody cared. But in the last 20 years, what's happened is that it's been consumer durables and consumer semi-durables, hand drills, the components that go into cars, that have been eaten away by imports, and this affects the mass of the voting population. So this contradiction worked for the first 20 years of this 40-year period, starts to not work politically for the last 20 years. And from a defense and dominance point of view, this matters much, much more. These last 20 years matter much, much more, because this is the era in which the hard, as it were, metal part of the US economy starts to disappear. And in particular, from 2008 onward, US manufacturing output is flat, even though the economy is growing. So from the point of view of dominance, there's a huge problem. And the second problem here is, again, that the current account deficit has its flip side, the ability of the US to put debt out into the world and find ready buyers. So you have endogenous credit creation in the world, funding the purchases of US dollar-denominated assets generated by the US economy. Again, up until the housing crash, this tended to put downward pressure on US interest rates, so it promoted US growth. That's not true after 2008. So that's more or less what I just said. The US government wants liquidity creation, credit creation to offset deflation. This leads to problems with potential financial crises because you need more and more finance. And the balance of payment deficit in the US potentially undermines confidence in the US economy and those assets, unless the US economy can generate growth that seemingly will validate those assets. And that's mostly been true. So if you look at aggregate GDP, what you see is that in real local currency terms and in current US dollar terms, over the last 30 years, the US has outgrown most economies. So the blue is GDP growth in total percentage terms from 1992 to 2021. The orange is in current US dollars. The blue matters in some sense more for domestic legitimacy. The orange matters more for global power. The US has outgrown most of the surplus countries. I don't think the US worries much about Australia or Taiwan, except in the sense of worrying about Taiwan. So the US, despite the current account deficit, has actually outgrown most of the surplus economies, which is an interesting paradox that points to the fact that we are in a hierarchical system where the extraction of resources is an important part of maintaining US dominance. Okay, a little more complicated. People don't invest in GDP. People invest in specific assets. So we could still ask the question, why do people hold these assets, right? Forget banks for a minute, but why do people hold these assets knowing that the US has a huge current account deficit, has rising foreign debt? And the answer is they hold assets because they want appreciation. And over the long run, the US economy not only has outgrown, but over the very long run, appreciation of US assets is significantly higher than for other countries' financial instruments. This is connected to empire. The US wins war, so stock markets don't crash. And the numbers here are really interesting. If you look at cumulative appreciation of US equities, the whole package of equities from 1900 to 2021, there's an annual 6.4% real return. If you look at the rest of the world, it's 4.3%. That may not look like a big difference, but because of compounding, what that means is a dollar invested in the US stock market in 1900, if you could have done that, there was no spider ETF, returns $2,024 by 2022. A dollar in the rest of the world returns only $176. And okay, that's the very long run. Most of us, as Keynes said, are dead in that long run. What about the more reasonable short run? Since 1990, US equities on average have returned 4.6 percentage points more per year than the broad index of rich world stocks. So that's what encourages actors in surplus economies to hold US equities. This is the source of confidence. And that source of confidence is, of course, underpinned by profits. Those share values reflect profits, and profits are disproportionately higher for US economy as a whole and for US domiciled firms. Big asterisk there. There's a reason I'm saying domiciled, but I save that for questions. But if we look at the 4,300 firms that have ever appeared on the Forbes Global 2000 list over the 2005 to 2022 lists, and we say, what's their share of profits from this list versus the share of GDP averaged 2017 to 2021, you get this table, which is basically to the point that the big US firms have a disproportionately high share of profits. US share of global GDP, about 25%. US share of profits for these large firms, which account for about a third of all profits globally, is 35% of that pool of profits. Other places not as profitable. And if we drill down one more level to ask what is it that underpins this disproportionate profitability, we can now think about how this reflects a power structure and not simply hardworking Americans outperforming Germans who find it more convenient to take vacation than to be in the factory making owners rich. Okay? So what you're seeing here are numbers. Behind these numbers is political reality. The political reality is that profitability in the current economy is a function of possession of intellectual property rights. I won't go too much into that in detail, but the disproportionate US profitability is a function of having a disproportionate number of firms with robust intellectual property rights, patent, trademark, copyright, brand. These are monopolies, and monopolies yield profits. Out in the rest of the world, you find two other kinds of firms, and because firms tend to cluster, that kind of corresponds to national economies. Some manufacturing firms that have a barrier to entry because of the scale of investment needed to enter the market. Think semiconductor fabs, a $20 billion investment. Or a barrier to entry because of tacit knowledge. Think the German Mittelstand, and then everybody else. And that's what you see here. So these firms are picked because they're best in class, supposedly. Microsoft actually is not that bad, despite the problems with Word and German automobile industry, and then Honhai, biggest assembler of electronics in the world. They assemble in any given year between 50 and 60% of everything you touch that's electronic in terms of like computing equipment. And what you see here is capital expenditures, employees in hatch, and then in orange, cumulative profits, 2004 to 2021. And what you can see is this interesting pattern, which is lots and lots of bodies, low wage labor, not much capital investment, not much profit in volume terms. Lots of bodies, lots of capital investment, reasonable profits, and then not much in the way of bodies, not much in the way of investment overall, and a huge pile of profits. One company is basically equal to the core of the German automobile industry, which is the core of the German economy. When you look at it as a per unit labor, per employee numbers, you see this. Very profitable, actually a very high level of capital equipment per person, but not a lot of people overall. Their profitability is a function of intellectual property rights. You used to be able to do this. If you could download a copy of Microsoft Office for free, would you? Right? Just like with a pizza, if you could download it, you would, but you can't anymore. Okay? They've put it on a subscription basis. It's in principle protected by copyrights and some patents, so it's illegal to do that. So in terms of confidence in the US economy, differential growth, you see here the political power structure that sustains this because those intellectual property rights are protected by the WTO TRIPS agreement, which is something the US pursued very aggressively in the 1970s and 80s. Okay. The last set of contradictions is again around current account surpluses and domestic political legitimacy. And this also, again, connects to the current account deficit. I've already talked a bit about this, but here the question is, what does the average person get from this system? Why would they support it? Why would US voters support the dollar as global quasi-state money? Why would they support an open trade regime, which is what enables the dollar to be used globally? And on the other side of it, in surplus countries, why restrain wages in order to get high levels of exports and, again, make owners rich? And here the problem is, if you're in a surplus economy, you do wage restraint, you get higher exports, the companies make big profits. It doesn't necessarily translate into higher wages. It doesn't translate into faster domestic growth. And what companies in surplus countries, of course, have been doing is very rational. The American economy and the Anglo economies grow faster than their own economy. They know that there may be some degree of rising protectionism, so they invest in those deficit countries rather than their own economy, which slows their home economy down, which is why I'm personally currently running 7 out of 10 trips on Deutsche Bahn, late, canceled, etc. So that's the legitimacy problem, and that, of course, also connects to rising wealth inequality in those countries. In the US, as I already said, you have the problem of hollowing of manufacturing, potentially slower income growth, also inequality. So this still favors the US. So this is the per capita GDP data. This is the per capita GDP data. Blue is purchasing power parity dollars. It's the only way to get comparable data. Orange is local currency. You can take purchasing power parity as a kind of measure of global power. The orange is the better indicator here, I think, for legitimacy. What are you really getting in terms of growth, again, over this 30-year period? And you can see that the US outgrows, again, in terms of per capita income, right, outgrows the major, not Spain, but outgrows the major European surplus economies. Okay, so to sum that up, the big problem here is that so far, while the US has outgrown its rich country rivals, it faces a growing problem of domestic legitimacy. And insofar as it has not been able to outgrow China, and remember, the US deliberately cultivated Chinese growth in the 1990s and 2000s. Because it has not been able to outgrow China, it faces a real problem of a real threat to its dominance. And that shows up in current US politics. For those of you who don't know Quinn Slobodian, really good book on the Mount Pelerin Society, but he's commenting here on a US senator from Missouri, which is one of the states that's had the biggest losses in manufacturing. And so you can see this guy, who otherwise is an idiot, basically saying, you're a multinational company, you want some favors, tell us why you're not manufacturing in the US. And so big point here is that the main problem is not so much economic. These contradictions produce not so much an economic problem as they produce a political problem of legitimacy, which is why I have emphasized that in this talk. And that goes to the point that David Kaleo and Susan Strange made a long time ago, that you cannot have your currency function as the world's, they don't say this, global quasi-state money, unless there's a solid domestic anchoring, solid domestic political anchoring. Okay, so to sum up, a lot of what I've said over the last 3 3/4 lectures, what the dollar is doing is serving as global quasi-state money. What that helps do is generate differential growth favoring the US mostly. The accumulation of dollars in foreign banks and central banks locks those systems to the Fed. It lowers financing costs for the US economy. By lowering those financing costs and by allowing U.S. firms to have robust domestic profits, validates the market capitalization of those firms, and it gives all these countries in the periphery a stake in the continued value and role of the U.S. dollar, until and unless. Okay. Now, Michael Pettis, and in a book with Matthew Klein, mostly talk about this as a problem of exorbitant burden. But my point is there's also exorbitant privilege, and you do need to look at both sides of that balance sheet. So the question then going forward is, why has there not been a successful threat to the US dollar? And you already know the answer to that as we go through it. But up until the current time period, most threats to the US dollar have not been from plausible challengers. So 1980s into the 1990s, the yen was posed as a potential challenger. At its peak, Japanese stock market capitalization was 40% of the global total, and Japan GDP at its peak, 18% of the global total. But this was a pyramid built on real estate values. And when that crashed, the shock turned everyone in Japan gray, and you can see the steady decline in Japanese GDP. The next plausible challenger was local hero, the euro. The shortest possible answer to why the euro is not a real contender is that there's no European state to provide the state in quasi-state money. There's no, you can see the list, no fiscal base, no military base, no plausible source for differential growth, partly because of the ECB, partly because of concerns about unemployment. And going forward, no clear policy towards China, which is going to hollow out. So now I make a prediction about the future, is going to hollow out the core of the German automobile industry. Also to the point, EU GDP and Eurozone GDP remain lower than US as a share of global GDP. And post-crisis, post-Eurozone crisis, the role of the euro in global credit creation basically flatlines while dollar credit creation increases. This is outside of the respective zones. So this is dollar-denominated bond issues outside of the US, and this is outside of the Eurozone. What about the BRICS, which is a made-up category, but it's out there in the literature, so I have to say 2 words about it. Everyone for the last year, because of sanctions around the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was talking about the BRICS going their own way. So this is how it started, and this is how it ended. Yeah, sorry if you don't stake your career on this. And so that leaves China. And with China, of course, you see a convergence of GDP, and that's why people think that it's plausible. I have two things to say about that, aside from making the same list that I made about the euro, which is one, China militarily is a regional power. The financial system is closed, which makes it difficult to actually use renminbi. Demographics don't favor China. For those of you who don't know, about 20% of Chinese youth, 15 to 24, are currently unemployed, which is kind of Spanish levels. And they have huge dollar-denominated foreign exchange reserves, which creates a transition problem. And then finally, if you're a global investor, you might worry about the low quality of Chinese windows. They're almost as bad as Russian windows. When people fall out of Russian windows, they usually fall. When they fall out of Chinese windows, they usually land in a prison. It's better. The second, that's a joke. You're supposed to laugh. Yeah, okay, all right. Right. But more profoundly, the projections on China have largely been these kind of straight line linear extrapolations, and they've largely turned out to be wrong because they weren't paying attention to these things. So this is a chart of when people forecasted China would catch up to the US. So in the early 2000s, they were talking quite late, 2040. By the year 2010, they were talking about maybe a few years, right? That's what this implies. A forecast in 2010 that they catch up by 2018. And the forecasts have been moving steadily farther out because of these issues. And in terms of how that relates to the dollar, critically, again, there's an asymmetry, which is the Chinese have a lot of outstanding dollar-denominated debt. US firms do not have renminbi-denominated debt. Okay, last few things. 4 minutes, patience. So now what? The first thing is we're clearly at an inflection point. Global trade as a percentage of GDP has been declining. It's been stagnant since the crisis. The same is true of financial flows, mostly because of, again, withdrawal of European banks from global lending. And of course, populist challenges everywhere. So this is not Goldilocks. The three choices here: rot, reboot, or war. If we go back, this is not the first time this has happened. If we go back to the 1970s, the US is faced with the same problems as a center of a global empire, and it reboots the world economy. This is a talk about money, but if you look at what happens in the 1970s, there is a reconfiguration of everything at the global level, driven by US policy choices. And this is, by the way, not to say they made the right choices all the time, and it's not to say they got what they wanted all the time, but there was a clear, consistent strategy of rewriting the rules around the global economy and the global geostrategic situation. So what you would be most familiar with, if in the money sense, is the end of Bretton Woods I and a shift to floating exchange rates, the elimination of capital controls. But there's also a shift in the economy driven by US defense-oriented research and development from dumb machines, again, think of that 1980 Golf automobile, to a digitalized economy and to the first biotech revolution. There's a change in trade rules to protect intellectual property rights and to crush the new international economic order, which was a challenge from the poor countries. There's a change in the relationship of the state to infrastructure, away from nation-building states to service sector deregulation and privatization. There's a change in US geostrategic posture from actually fighting wars to having the locals put boots on the ground and die while capital-intensive US naval and air power back them up. And there's a change in the posture against the communist countries to detach China from Russia. Détente was possible because once Russia's confronted with a two-front war, you can be nicer. And that's what also allows arms control. And then finally, I can't go into this in any detail right now, but you can ask in questions, the use of the oil shock as a geopolitical weapon. So with that in mind, which is to say, knowing that this has been done once before, what is the US strategy today? Or again, what would Jake Sullivan like to see in the world? Where again, we're at a transitional moment. The ICT growth wave is over. The biotech one growth wave is over. You can see on the horizon artificial intelligence, not so much in the way the media talks about it. The second biotech revolution, new materials, new energy sources. You can see an effort to change trade relations again. The WTO is basically dead at this point. The US is now emphasizing bilateral treaties and using the threat of industrial policy to bring countries on board. There's a shift in where energy is coming from. The old strategy of engaging China, a la Clinton in the 1990s, is now to confront China. This I'm a little less sure about. Neoliberal domestic policy is giving way to at least an effort by the Democrats in the Congress to update and expand the welfare state. And the Fed now is in touch with every part of the financial system, even if it can't control it. So that's the reboot option. By the way, this is the rot option. This is the reboot option. And you can see recognition of this in Europe. And what is being recognized here is this, which is to say a massive federal effort to subsidize an entirely new industrial base for the US around electric vehicles, which has enormous consequences for the semiconductor industry and the materials supply chain. The green dots are private sector investments in batteries here. The other ones are federal investments. The green dots are there because of subsidies. And this has led to a massive increase in, which is this list bit at the end you might miss, massive increase in manufacturing construction. That's the dollar side of the map you just saw, okay? And of course, so rot, reboot, but there's also this possibility of an unhappy situation with the Chinese. Myself prefer a quiet retirement, so I hope this doesn't happen, but it is potentially out there. So that's where we are. The dollar is, in terms of rot, reboot, and war, therefore in an unstable position. The rot option here would see a reduction of dollar centrality in the world economy, chaotic US policy, lots of problems. The reboot option would retain dollar centrality, and the war option, everything is open, although we know from the British experience, World War I, World War II, that things don't usually go well in terms of retaining centrality when you fight a global war. Thanks for your patience in 3 overlong lectures. And I guess now we have the usual 3 minutes of conversation, and then I'll take questions.
Thank you.